Hello and welcome. My name is Steven Springhorn. I'm a member of the DWR Sustainable Groundwater Management Program team, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending the inaugural Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA session webinar series. This is a new webinar series developed by DWR for the purpose of distributing important SGMA-related information, including regulatory and technical topics, to GSAs and related stakeholders, with the goal of providing consistent SGMA messaging and understanding and the timely release of important and relevant information to GSAs and the public. The topic of today's webinar is related to DWR's technical assistance and is focused on the newly released California DWR Land Use Viewer and the related land use data it contains. The specific topics we'll be covering today in the webinar are the following, which will be presented by a number of members of our land use project team, starting with Stephanie Horry from the Center of Collaborative Policy, who is our facilitator today, and will be providing an overview of the webinar instructions, including how to submit questions. I'll be providing a brief SGMA background and DWR's related SGMA assistance activities. Then Curtis Anderson from DWR, who is the chief of DWR's Northern Region office in Red Bluff, will go over the background, history, and future steps of DWR's land use program. We are also joined by Simon Etching, who is DWR's land use program manager, and he will be participating in the Q&A session. The next topic will be covered by Joel Kimmelshoe from Land IQ, who is the principal scientist and consultant that generated the statewide land use data that we'll be talking about today. And Joel will be going into specifics on that land use data. Then we'll turn it over to Wyatt Arnold from DWR, who is also a member of our Sustainable Groundwater Management Program and is the developer of the new Land Use Viewer. And he'll be giving a live demo of that tool. And then we'll follow these talks with a Q&A session related to the topics covered today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie to go over the webinar instructions.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Sorry for the disturbance. Okay. Hi, everyone. Like Stephen said, my name is Stephanie Horry. I'm with the Center for Collaborative Policy with California State University, Sacramento. And I'd like to quickly go over how you can participate in today's webinar. As it states right here, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto DWR's Data Tools and Reports webpage, and the link to that webpage is spelled out below. So if you have been part of our webinars in the past, you're probably used to how this goes. You can type a question or comment anytime during the webinar, and the staff will be keeping a queue of those who have shared their question or comment. When we get to the Q&A session, DWR staff will read your question or comment aloud. If you are calling in only, you can contact me to receive the presentation slides so that way you can follow along. My email address is spelled shorii@ccp.csus.edu. It is the same point of contact email that you should have received when you registered for the webinar. And again, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available at the webpage written below. And as we know, webinars are quirky sometimes, so contact me if you are having any technical difficulties, and I will work with you to troubleshoot. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Okay, I'd like to spend just a few minutes going over SGMA background and related SGMA activities, assistance activities the department is working on, and how this land use data fits into those activities. So at the highest level, SGMA can be boiled down into two fundamental principles. The first is local control, and this has been a guiding principle throughout the development of the legislation and the signing of that legislation over 3 years ago now. And we've carried that through the development of regulations and other aspects of SGMA implementation. There are 3 main entities that have new roles and responsibilities under SGMA. The first is the Department of Water Resources. We have a dual role of providing technical assistance, which we have a long history of doing at the department, but we also have a new role of a more regulating or regulatory process in evaluating these new groundwater sustainability plans that will be coming to us. Those groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs for short, will be developed by GSAs, or groundwater sustainability agencies, which is another entity and has the heaviest lift in SGMA, because the GSAs are responsible for developing and implementing these new groundwater sustainability plans. The third entity related to SGMA is the State Water Resources Control Board, and they're the enforcing agency if a groundwater sustainability plan is not submitted to the department or it's found inadequate. And if that occurs, then the State Board can step in and work with the GSAs in that basin to get back on track to sustainability. And throughout each of the different phases of SGMA, there are many requirements and opportunities for stakeholders to be involved in this process. The other fundamental principle of SGMA is sustainability. And sustainability is new to many parts of California, and it is defined in a new way under this new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act by what are called undesirable results that are related to lowering groundwater levels, changes in groundwater storage, water quality, land subsidence, and surface water-groundwater interaction. You could think of these as the key performance metrics that local agencies, the GSAs and DWR, will be tracking in these high and medium priority basins shown in the map in orange and yellow. So there are a few steps, or high-level steps in SGMA implementation. The first step is the formation of these GSAs, which we just reached just in June, the end of June, a major milestone, which was a very big success in an early step of SGMA implementation, where we had 99.9% of the area that was required to be covered, that was covered by these GSAs. There was a lot of hard work and coordination that went on at the local level, and that's a great sign of things to come. The second step is where folks are now, is the development of these groundwater sustainability plans, with the first ones being due a little over 2.5 years from now in 2020. And that's where the focus of today's presentation is on assistance, technical assistance, and providing data to GSAs so they can use that information if they need to develop these plans. The third step is implementing these plans, these GSAs, over a 20-year planning horizon to achieve sustainability. And again, the land use data that we'll be presenting today is an important component of both developing and implementing these GSPs through time. So there are a lot of new requirements and work ahead for groundwater sustainability agencies, and the department is working in a number of areas to provide assistance through our advisory role. We're talking today about a technical assistance, and such as statewide data sets like the land use data. We're also developing other tools, and we've developed best management practices and other reports that could be useful for GSAs and other related stakeholders through the SGMA planning process and outside the SGMA planning process. And for the goal to provide these data tools and reports for GSAs and others to use in the development of their groundwater sustainability plans. Other areas where we're working are planning assistance. There's a team of folks working on facilitation support services and GSA support services. That's been ongoing through the GSA formation process and continues to occur throughout the basins in the state. And then the third component is financial assistance. There is our financial assistance branch within DWR is currently working on a Proposition 1 groundwater grant application that's currently open. And that is money set aside for groundwater sustainability agencies and other related entities for the purposes of developing these groundwater sustainability plans and other components related to SGMA. So for more information on these variety of assistance components, there are a number of websites. Up at the top, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program website is a good resource for all of the components that I mentioned in the previous slide. There's also the Land Use Program that Simon Etching leads and others. That there's good information on the land use program at that site. And then the two websites below are more specific sites to where, on the left, where the Data Tools and Reports webpage, where you can find this new land use viewer, as well as other relevant groundwater-related tools, data, and reports. And then there's the DWR SGMA portal, where information is reported related to the various SGMA activities. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Curtis Anderson to give an intro and background on land use data.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to give a little bit of background of the land use program that we have and how that's being incorporated into the SGMA program. So why does DWR collect land use information? So DWR works with other agencies and the public to kind of develop strategic goals and actions to manage water effectively. So that could be water conservation, development, sustainability of California's water resources on a statewide basis. In 1947, with California's economy booming from the post-war era, the legislature started requesting investigation for present and future water needs for the citizens of California. So in 1954, the Department of Water Resources began a formal program to determine agricultural as well as urban water use, and we incorporated that into the California Water Plan, which is updated every 5 years. And currently, DWR is working on update 2018. By the mid-1960s, DWR, in cooperation with other agencies and locals, had classified to some degree most of the agricultural and urban lands within California, and that work continues today. And as was mentioned earlier, Simon Etching is the program manager for that program for the Department of Water Resources. So how do we collect land use? And the way we collect land use has changed over time as technology has changed. So originally, when we started doing this, we used various sources of aerial photography. So if anybody's familiar with the old 9x9 USDA photos that were taken all over the United States, we started using those, and we would get copies of the photos, and we would actually draw by hand what we thought the individual land uses were on those 9x9 photos. And then as technology increased, we actually contracted to have airplanes flown and 35mm air photos taken. And then what we would do is we would transfer what we saw on those 35mm air photos onto USGS quad maps. And then what we do is we'd take, once we'd fill out a whole quad map of land use, we would actually cut out the individual land use categories, and we would weigh them on a chemical balance, and we would actually get the weight, and we would convert that weight into area, and we could calculate the area of crops within that quad. And some people laugh at that technology, but it was actually was pretty accurate. But in 1992, the department switched to using Geographic Information System, GIS software, to delineate the boundaries and to calculate areas and different information which from air photos, which could be taken right into the GIS software and digitized directly. So all of these methods, whether it was on the original 9x9 or the air photos or the quads or the GIS, it still requires extensive work out in the field to confirm what you're seeing. So you may be able to recognize certain orchard patterns from an air photo, but annual crops need to be field verified. And so what we have is DWR has 4 regional offices, and they're funded to go out and do this field work of determining what the land use is. And each of these 4 region offices had enough funding and enough people and enough resources to basically do between anywhere from 2 to 3 counties per year. And so the region office staff would go out, they'd drive on public roads, they would mark down on their maps what they saw out in the field, and then they'd bring that into the office and they'd collect that for a whole county. And so being able to do that for 4 regional offices, being able to do 2 to 3 counties per year, translated statewide to only being able to do 4 to 12 counties every year. And so in between years, when we actually didn't do a county, we would true up the information by using ag commissioner reports. And so some of the issues that we ran across in doing it this way was that the county ag commissioner reports are tabular and not spatial. So say we did a county in one year and we identified a crop as almonds or walnuts or lettuce or something, and then we could aggregate that on a countywide basis. The next year we would have to use the ag commissioner reports to kind of true that out. But we didn't know where, if the lettuce acreage went down, we don't know specifically which fields were no longer lettuce. So we had to make assumptions and guesses at that. And over time, there was greater and greater drift of what the actual land use on a field-by-field basis was when these DWR surveys weren't done. And then the inaccuracies got compounded even more when we were trying to aggregate that on much larger areas of the state or even the entire state at one time. And so here's an example of what I'm talking about. So say that in 1991, the regional offices were able to do complete land use in these counties highlighted in blue here. So this is 1991. And then the next years they went out and they did these counties in red in 1992. And then these green counties in 1993. And then these yellow counties in 1994. So you can see there's still a number of counties throughout California that we haven't done surveys yet. And the data from originally in the blue ones those are still changing every year. And so you can see that if we start aggregating on a statewide basis, that there's a lot of inaccuracies that get introduced. And this really came to light during this most recent severe drought that we had here in California. And especially, so in March of 2015, there was an op-ed in the LA Times by Jay Famietti, who estimated that California had 1 year of storage left. It was reported in the paper as we had 1 year of water left. And so DWR's director asked the question, is that true? And it was relatively easy to determine from the surface water side of things if that was true or not. You just add up all of the reservoir storage, you make some estimates of if we could deliver water to certain areas of the state. But the really difficult thing to estimate was the actual water use that was going to be required for the rest of that summer because we didn't have up-to-date statewide land use information. And so then we decided it's necessary to switch to doing statewide land use as opposed to the county-by-county basis. And the reasons were, number one was in 2014, we went through this for SGMA, a basin prioritization process, and that required an accurate assessment of what the groundwater was for the groundwater basins throughout all of California. For the initial basin prioritization, DWR used the results from the CASGEM basin prioritization to determine high and medium priority basins. The DWR wanted to increase the accuracy, the repeatability, and the defensibility of future basin prioritization efforts so that we can have more confidence in the results of that. And then internally, there's many programs that utilize the land use data. So we have the California Water Plan that looks at what the water use is now. It projects what the water use is going to be in the future and how we're going to address those water uses. The Bay Delta Program, Water Use Efficiency Program, drought planning, as I discussed previously. So we have a lot of programs in DWR that could utilize highly accurate statewide land use data. And then externally, the public can use this information, the GSAs can use this information, other private organizations. It's just there's a need for accurate and timely land use information throughout California. So how are we switching to do statewide land use now? So we had, in the last 5 years, working with more and more contractors that started utilizing remote sensing. And so last year, DWR, the Natural Resources Agency, and the Governor's Office developed a 4-year budget change proposal to fund DWR to acquire statewide land use using remote sensing. And with that funding, in April of 2016, DWR sent out an RFQ request for qualifications for a multi-year contract to provide statewide land use using remote sensing. And Land IQ was selected as the most qualified company for this contract. So we executed Task Order 1, and I'm the Task Order Manager for the Task Order 1, and that involved determining statewide land use for crop year 2014. And that has recently been completed, and that's the information that we are presenting in this webinar today. Task Order 2, which involves determining statewide land use for crop year 2016, has been signed, and the ground truthing has been completed, but we haven't started, and we're just starting on the analysis of that 2016 data. And then DWR is planning to have subsequent land use determinations for crop year 2018, 2020, and possibly 2022, depending on funding availability. So a little bit of additional information. So this land use information for crop year 2014, so this is the major crop that was grown during the summer of 2014. We realize that there is multiple, some areas have multiple crops, double cropping, triple cropping. This is only representing the major crop that was grown in the summer of 2014. And as Joel will go over in his presentation, this isn't 100% accurate. It's very accurate, but there is inaccuracies when you're talking about getting land use for 10 million acres in California. And so just keep that in mind. It is accurate in many areas, and there are areas that we do need your input and help to make more accurate in the future. This was DWR's first release of statewide land use. So remember, before we were doing it on a county-by-county basis. The emphasis on this was to get statewide data. And so we're realizing that we are sacrificing a little bit of accuracy when we do this, as opposed to the county-by-county detailed surveys. But again, that is outweighed by being able to get this on a statewide basis. So we're documenting and paying close attention to what's worked well and what didn't work well, and how we can improve this in the future. But DWR really believes that we're providing the most accurate, comprehensive, and useful water data information possible, and that the citizens of California really deserve that information. So we welcome your comments and suggestions. This information has been live for about a week, and we're already getting input on what people like and ideas of how we could improve things. And we really do welcome your comments and suggestions on how we can meet your needs and how we can improve on this effort. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Joel Kimishu from Land IQ, and he'll explain his process there.
Well, thank you, Curtis. Again, I'm Joel Kimishu with Land IQ. We're a firm centered here in Sacramento, also with an office in Los Angeles. And the best way to describe Land IQ is we're a small firm, about 30 people or so. And we center into two main technical areas I like to call land-based scientists and spatial scientists. And both of us inform one another. So our land-based scientists group is a group focused on agricultural and natural systems land use. And then our spatial scientists consist of GIS, remote sensing, and other technical programmers and expertise. We find that very valuable in the fact that we can inform one another and learn from one another, and the end result is a product that you'll see today. I'll go into California statewide land use mapping. I'd like to thank the Department of Water Resources for the opportunity to do this for the state of California. It's been a very gratifying undertaking, and we're very, very pleased with the product for such a large undertaking. So our statewide land use hasn't happened overnight. We've been developing this for about 10 years through various research and development efforts, various approaches with different organizations and different entities that asked us historically to say, can you provide us with land use for an irrigation district, for a watershed? We want to do some groundwater modeling or some surface water modeling or things like that. And back in the day, we, as many of you on the line today probably have done before, pieced together the best resources that were available, but always found that we had some holes here and there, or things weren't consistent with regards to the temporal component or use over time, and Curtis mentioned that in his presentation. So our statewide land use map, so we said we want to create kind of a better widget, and so we went into some pretty aggressive efforts to determine how to do this for every single field in the state of California. So I'll start off by describing that our statewide land use mapping is centered on three very kind of hierarchical levels, that being agricultural production systems, managed wetlands, and also urban areas. The results are accurate crop maps. The accuracy I'll talk about a little bit later, but a precursor will let you know that the overall accuracy is about 96.6% across the landscape. Statistics and that information will be used for overall land use change analysis, and we're very excited and interested to see how you all folks use the information in the various ways that you will. Our approach is centered on continually updating and creating accurate film boundaries of the irrigated portion only of the field. So this excludes farm shops, roads within ag systems, staging pads, all sorts of things that are not irrigated. So you should be assured that the data that you can use here is indeed the irrigated portion of the field only. Those boundaries were developed by both an automated and manual process, and we are constantly updating those boundaries as land use changes. We also employ a very comprehensive and aggressive ground truthing, some ground truthing efforts that amount to 10 to 12 and sometimes up to 15% of the irrigated ground. We do that for two reasons. One, we take part of that ground truthing data set and use it as our training data set for the algorithms that we've developed that basically determine the fingerprint of what an almond orchard is, or the fingerprint of an alfalfa field, etc. We also take a subset of that data and pretend basically that we never drove by it and we never collected it, but we're sure of what it was, and we apply our algorithms to that subset for an accuracy assessment or validation component of the data set. We basically say how well did our algorithms predict what that crop or land use would be on the ground. We use multiple imagery sources, whatever we can get our hands on, which includes NAEP, National Agricultural Imaging Program, imagery, Landsat, RapidEye, Sentinel, SAR, and any other thing that we can get our hands on in what we call a multiple lines of evidence to improve our accuracies. We have to achieve an accuracy exceeding 95% according to the terms of the work that we do for DWR, and so we have to be very accurate with regards to the field boundaries, aggressive, comprehensive ground truthing, and utilizing as many resources as we can. I mentioned earlier that we have a kind of a two-headed monster in our organization, and that's land-based scientists and spatial scientists. That land-based knowledge and knowing phenological growth cycles of crops, when things are planted, when things flower, when things leaf, how they change from north to south in the state is really critical with regards to, again, improving the accuracies of prediction. We implement both remotely sensed and photo-interpretive approaches, and those other lines of evidence that we use include DWR, historic DWR mapping, county crop reports, CDL layer from USDA, crop data layer, pesticides use reports, and a multitude of other resources. So in a broader sense, our land use classifications comprise the entire state of California, from Mexico to Oregon, Nevada to the Pacific Ocean. Overall, there are over 360,000 individually classified polygons, down to 2 acres in size. The major land use categories that we classify, of course, include the ones I've previously mentioned: agriculture, urban, and managed wetlands. It's interesting to note, for some kind of discussion statistics in a broader sense, agriculture in 2014, that includes fallow or idle ground as well, was about 9.07 million acres. Urban areas were half again as much, at about 4.5 million acres. And managed wetlands, which are refuges and private and public areas that are termed as managed wetlands, comprised about almost 600,000 acres. So agriculture includes both irrigated and fallow fields, and also fields that may not be irrigated in fringe areas, but only that irrigated or cropped area within those fields was delineated. Again, we removed farm shops, roads, anything that was not irrigated or potentially irrigated. Managed wetlands similarly include only the irrigated or wetted area within the jurisdictional or legal boundary of that managed wetlands, meaning if there was a high and dry spot that never receives water, we did not include that. This is intended to be a tool or a data set that is used for consumptive use purposes, so we want to know where the wetted parts are or the drier parts are. And lastly, we went ahead, and you can see that in the map to the left, the pink areas are represented as urban areas, and we classified the outer boundary between the urban and another land use, which could be agriculture, it could be native areas, it could be managed wetland, or a variety of different areas, but it truly does indicate the outer boundary of the urban area. So some continued statistics from an agricultural perspective. The minimum field size of our delineations are to 2 acres. Some fields actually in the data set are less, but our specifications were to go down to 2 acres. The overall statewide accuracy of the data from an agricultural perspective, again, is 96.6% based on an independent ground truth validation data set, of which I previously discussed. Our legend for crops, and Wyatt will talk about this in a moment, is about 45, a little bit more, individual crops, which Those 45 crops make up about 98% of all irrigated lands within the state. The remaining 2% of crops are categorized into the 6 subcategories from a miscellaneous standpoint and include unique things like parsley and cilantro and other much smaller acreage crops. But we do not ignore those. We do classify those into miscellaneous categories. We always say here in California that we produce 300 to 400 different types of crops, and indeed we do. But at some point there's a point of diminishing return for the purposes of how we establish this land use data set statewide, and we did cover 98% of the crops, which comprise about 45 different crops. So let's take a little journey from north to south in the state of California, and from a DWR region perspective, it's kind of interesting just to look at what's in each of these regions. So in the northern region, the total cropped and idle land area amounted to nearly 1.5 million acres, and the major crops include the ones that are listed here: rice, walnuts, almonds, alfalfa, mixed pasture, prunes, grapes and olives, and others. You can see the legend on the right-hand side that this is the standard legend for this 45-plus crop legend that I previously discussed. It's very interesting to see the distribution of these crops within the regions and also from north to south within the state. So let's travel one DWR region south to the north central region. Same legend, but the major crops, some are similar and some are different. We begin to see a lot more grapes in this region, as you might surmise, in Napa and Solano counties, and then also in some of the valley areas as well. We begin to pick up a lot more tomatoes and other crops. And don't forget, this data set also identified fallow or idle ground as well. The total cropped acreage in the north central region was a little over 1.6 million acres, so somewhat similar to the northern region. Then we kind of transition into the big boy of the 4 regions, and this is the south central region, which comprises basically all of the San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley and some of the smaller coastal valleys. But again, we see a change in crop types. There's some consistent ones that you might see across the state, but others you may see new ones, which include, in this case, pistachios, citrus, a lot more corn and sorghum, cotton, and those types of crops in the south central region of DWR's regions. This one is a dominant acreage area in the south central region, which nearly approaches 5 million acres of total cropped and idle land. And finally, in the southern region, something even more unique and different. We see a lot of subtropical citrus, avocados, a lot of lettuce, leafy greens, carrots, and other truck crops, strawberries. The total crop ground and idle land there is approaching 1 million acres. So get into this a little bit more with regards to how we do the work we do. Again, I mentioned field boundaries are very critical, and so we develop both through an automated and manual process every single field boundary of every single field in the state. That amounts to over 360,000 field boundaries. And I'll zoom in just a little bit more, and you can see on this map here, if my mouse is showing, I hope, but if it's not, I can describe it to you. You'll see fields with like notches out of them. And those are farm shops or homesteads or things like that, staging pads for ag operations, whereby that is not an irrigated portion of the field. So you should be confident that very confident that the boundaries on these fields represent the true irrigated portion of the field. And that's very important for modeling purposes and such. So we'll talk now a little bit, that was the ag side of things. Now let's talk just briefly about the managed wetland and urban side of things. We went ahead and delineated all managed wetlands, both federal, state, private, wildlife, wetlands, duck clubs, anything that had water going to it. So it's the wetted area. You can just think of it as another type of crop in a sense. And so all those are mapped again, and those approach in the state upwards of 600,000 acres. And urban, as I mentioned before, was classified by land use only. I want to clarify, these are not jurisdictional boundaries. These are not legal boundaries. They are, I mean, everyone needs to be thinking about this from a land use perspective. What's going on the surface of the land? So some statistical highlights, and it's all in the data sets that you can download, but here are some. Here again, urban about 4.5 million, approaching 600,000 acres. On managed wetlands and ag is a shade over 9 million acres. But totally, in total, we classified over 14.2 million acres. So many people ask us, okay, so that's all well and good, but how accurate are you? We use a standardized approach for remote sensing to determine both omission and commission errors. That basically means, did I call an almond orchard a peach orchard when it should have been an almond orchard, or vice versa? We set aside, again, a portion of that ground truthing data as an independent validation data set to statistically determine and quantitatively determine the error, which is about 3.4%. I want to make a comment here that says, you know, when we do have an error in the smaller error category of 3.4% statewide, we probably confuse it with a similar consumptive use crop, which includes maybe confusing an almond orchard with a peach orchard. We rarely confuse an almond orchard with a carrot field, for example. So you should have great confidence with regards to the ability to look at these land use data from a consumptive use perspective. And here's one portion of the accuracy assessment, the omission error summary. And our accuracies do vary by crop due to the sample size from the ground truthing data that we acquire. And but however, our larger acreages, because we are able to require so many ground truthing points, are usually highly accurate. For example, our almond acreage is about 98.8% accurate. Again, our overall statewide accuracy goal was 95%, and we achieved 96.6%. So conclusions and upcoming efforts. As Curtis mentioned, we are now conducting the 2016 analysis classification. We've completed the ground truthing in 2016. And it's interesting to note, even in the preliminary classification, to see the significant changes in some of the differences between 2014 and 2016. For example, we are always adjusting and readjusting field boundaries to make sure we're only including the irrigated portion. And we found that between these two data sets, about 10 to 15% of the agricultural field boundaries actually change. A grower will split a field or such. We continued expansion of permanent crops. We see that constantly. Almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and other permanent crops continue to expand in the state. And we see also a continued expansion of urban areas as compared to 2014. We have finished a portion of the 2017 ground truthing for the Central Valley, and then also in other areas of the state. And we are in the planning stages for implementing multi-cropping analysis in the 2017 hydrologic water year. So I'll go ahead and introduce Wyatt Arnold now, and he'll give you a summary of the land use viewer and how this information can be disseminated out to you all.
Thank you, Joel. All right, so we're going to open up the application now. My name is Wyatt Arnold. I'm with the Sustainable Groundwater Management branch at the department. And I was tasked with developing this web application so we could make the data available to everyone, view it in the web browser, and also just do some basic analysis to answer any immediate questions you may have about the data. So here, let me see if I can make this a little easier. All right, so the first thing you'll see when you come into the application is a disclaimer. This is just a general statement about accuracy of viewing land use information in a web browser. It's been reprojected the boundaries of the field do not establish legal rights or define legal boundaries, and the department cannot guarantee the accuracy, completeness, or timeliness of the information. And so neither the department nor any sources of the information shall be responsible for any errors or omissions or for the use of the results obtained from using this information. So once we get past that, we accept, we move on. So this is what you'll see. You'll see on your right a layer list with the county land use, bulletin 118 groundwater basin boundaries, and the statewide crop mapping, which is on by default. And so that's what you see in front of you in the map. But first I want to cover this information widget by clicking that I in the top header bar. And so here you'll have a short introduction of about the viewer, the benefits to GSAs and water managers, how DWR uses this data, and also a link to our data tools and reports page. We also have a tab with a detailed explanation of the statewide crop mapping 2014 data set. There is a slide that helps you navigate the legend, basically the crop legend at the standard legend scale to the remotely sensed crop scale, and then that also crosswalks to DWR's 20 major crops. And so to help you navigate, okay, what category does this specific subcrop fall under, this slide can help you a lot. We also have extracted the main background, methods and data collection, and an accuracy report. We've extracted this from LandIQ's statewide crop mapping 2014 report, which you can download and read if you want additional details on how accurate the land use remote sensing analysis was and so forth. The next tab is information about county land use surveys. This information is also available in the web viewer for download and also viewing. It also describes how you can access that information with the tools in the web viewer. There is also background information about the DWR county surveys. There is a county survey attribute PDF available for you to read, as well as our latest standard land use legend. It's important to note that through time, this standard land use legend has evolved. This is the latest one, but when you download a DWR county land use survey, you will receive the appropriate land use legend as well as attribute information that applies to that particular year the survey was done in. There's also a map tutorial as well as some contact information. Okay, so next, you may come to this viewer really interested in just grabbing the data. And so you can do that by clicking, if you want the data for the entire state, you can click the download button and get the data as a file geodatabase or a shapefile. Otherwise, if you want the data clipped to a certain area, we've pre-clipped the statewide crop mapping to the county boundaries as well as the Bulletin 118 groundwater basins. And so how you would get statewide land use data clipped to those boundaries is you would turn on the county land use download, for example, this layer, select a county, Plymouth County in this case. There have been 4 surveys, and this related table will show you the surveys available. So, of course, the first one, the latest one, is the statewide remote sensing 2014 data set, and so you could download the remote sensing data set clipped to the Plymouth County boundaries. We also have the provisional DWR county survey from 2013 as well as 2007, and the production level fully vetted data set from 1997. So we've chosen to make the provisional DWR county survey data sets available because we want to get as much information out there as possible, of course with the accompanied disclaimer that you are using provisional data. It hasn't gone through the full vetting process that the department has for DWR county surveys, but we are still making those available for provisional analysis. If you wanted that data click to the basins, you could turn on the basin layer, and there's actually only one download available for the groundwater basins, and that is the statewide crop mapping 2014. We did not compile county land use surveys from different years and clip those to the boundaries, because that would require us to make certain decisions about which county surveys to use. And so you would need to download separate county surveys and compile those into the basin on your GIS desktop software if that's your intent. Okay, so that's downloading the data. Let's move on to the legend. So you'll notice here that it's a little bit different from Joel's slides. We've symbolized the data in this viewer at the standard legend level. This standard legend, from rise pasture all the way to urban, has been modified to represent the remote sensing analysis. There are essentially two main differences from the county DWR County Survey standard legend, and that is the young perennial category and the idle category. These have been added to the top level standard class for two reasons. One, young perennial, the remote sensing analysis cannot tell if it's a walnut stick or a vineyard stick. It just looks like sticks in the ground. And so it's been classified as a young perennial. That's the most granular we can get at it. And so with a DWR County survey, you'll know what kind of orchard it is, and then you'll add on an attribute with the orchard saying this is the young perennial walnut. So that's a difference. The second is idle. Because this is one snapshot in time from the summer of 2014, there's no previous information about what the crop was in the past. So idle and fallow have been grouped together and brought up to the top level as an idle field. In the DWR County surveys, you'll see corn modified with the attribute of idle or fallow, essentially saying it was corn in the past, now it's been fallowed. Okay, and also just to point out that the native riparian category includes managed wetlands. And it happens to be that the statewide remote sensing data set only classified managed wetlands. It didn't classify riparian vegetation, which is also a subclass of native riparian vegetation. So what you see in this standard class are only managed wetlands. Okay, so now let's just go around the state and look around. We'll go into the north part of the state here and zoom in. And what you can do is click a field, and when you're clicking the statewide crop mapping data set, you'll see some attributes pop up here. Pasture, the remotely sensed crop was miscellaneous grasses in this case. It will give you an acreage for that field, as well as the source, the date it refers to, and the last modified date. This is an Atlas data set. It's an enterprise data set that the department will maintain. And so if there are modifications to this data set that are improved through public input or subsequent analysis, you will see that that field has been modified, and it will tell you the date it has been modified. Okay, so we can just zoom around, click other fields. Here's a alfalfa and alfalfa mixture field that's classified as the standard legend as pasture. And so it's relatively easy to just zoom around the state quickly and visually digest what the land use is for different areas. The other thing that we've made available, and this is actually thanks to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they've made the NAPE 2014 imagery as a web service on their ArcGIS server. And so we've pointed to that endpoint, and we can actually turn on the NAPE 2014, which was the one of the most important base layers for this remote sensing analysis. And you can swipe on and off the statewide 2014 crop mapping and look at that against the actual NAPE imagery, the 1 meter resolution imagery. And you can choose which If you prefer to, swipe the nape under it, it makes more sense to take the top layer and swipe that on and off. Okay. So the next thing I'll show you is dynamic crop filtering. So up here on the header bar, there's a blue filter icon. That's the dynamic land use filter. And so you'll see a list here of the standard legend crops under crop mapping 2014 with the green, and then county surveys with the blue. And so what you can do is turn on specific crops. Clearly there's no rice in Imperial Valley, but there's pasture. And so you can dynamically filter down to specific standard legend crops dynamically. It's important to note, though, that as you zoom out, I think this is about the highest zoom level. If you go out this far, it will disappear. And the reason is because when we're filtering in the web viewer, we are making requests for the actual vector data. And so that's a little more heavy, and it could slow down the application. So it's better to stay in at closer zoom levels when you're filtering to specific crops. And so that's the crop mapping 2014 pasture. Let's see what the DWR County Survey pasture has been mapped as. And so when you first turn on the County Survey pasture, or any crop under the county surveys for that matter, you're returning all the pasture fields that have been identified in any number of years. And so to filter down to a certain time frame, you'll want to use the time slider. And I'll just turn off the crop mapping 2014 so this is easier for folks to see. So right now we are in the time frame of 1986 to 1989. We don't have any survey available within that time period. So let's move forward a step. There's no survey between that period. There's the first survey available in this web map viewer, Imperial County Survey from 1997. And you'll actually see it show up as blue. So if we zoom out here, you'll see Imperial County highlighted. And that's because as you slide the viewer, you'll actually see other counties within that time frame that have a DWR survey highlighted. So over here in the Santa Barbara County, as well as San Luis Obispo County. So let's go back to Imperial. Let's look at the pasture, visually inspect the pasture fields from 1997. So that's what we see. I'm actually going to change the base map so it's a little bit clearer. If we use the dark gray canvas, it improves the contrast. And so we can see the color against the background much easier. Go back to the filter. And so now I'll turn on crop mapping 2014 pasture. And you'll see now it's a good time to use the swipe tool. And so if we take statewide crop mapping for 2014 pasture and swipe that on and off the map, we can see definitely fields that were something else have been changed to pasture. And we could do the reverse, take the county survey, and see that some fields that were pasture are no longer pasture. And so that's a visual confirmation of, at the standard legend level, simple analysis that you can do with this viewer. Okay, so the next step is going to be a little bit more advanced, and it's going to require a little bit of patience, but let's go to the spatial query. And so here's where you can actually quantify the acreage of land use change over time. And I will turn off these crops because we're going to use a different method of getting at the data. So we'll turn on the layer list. Let's turn on the basin boundary layer as our reference. So the land use spatial query will actually take in some sort of spatial boundary, whether it's the basin, the county, whether it's a boundary you've uploaded to the application as a reference boundary. And so you'll see it separated out into statewide crop mapping ag, county survey agriculture. We also have the native classes, and for the statewide crop mapping, again, it's only managed wetlands, but for the DWR, we'll have the full subclasses under native, as well as urban. And so these have been separated out to make querying a little bit more quick and easy for the user. And so now let's go to the ag statewide crop mapping, and we've made it so that you can select a specific standard legend crop, or for example, if you just want irrigated acres, no idle land, you could say standard legend is not idle. Or you can go all the way down to the remotely sensed crop level. And so let's say we want, we'll stick at the standard legend, and we'll go with pasture. And so here the spatial filter only return features that have a spatial relationship with the features in another layer. And so in this case, we're going to use the Bulletin 118 basin boundaries. You could also draw your own shape on the map. But in this case, we're going to use the reference layer. Let's select spatial relationship intersect. If you choose within, the field has to be completely within the boundary. And so that can sometimes skew the results if you're not careful. So we'll choose intersect. We'll choose the related layer. Ooh, I can't see it. Here, you can just take that and move it. All right, so take the widget, move it up if you can't see that layer down there. That's the Bulletin 118 groundwater basins. Choose the square, select the basin. You can also select multiple basins if that's your intent, but here we're just going to do Imperial Valley. You can apply search buffer distance. That's useful if you're using point information or polylines. So let's make sure we have standard legend pasture. We've selected the basin. Now we can hit execute. We'll name this as Imperial Valley Pasture 2014. There are a lot of pasture fields, apparently. We'll let the script continue to run for just a little bit longer. Okay, we'll stop the script and we'll choose maybe a subclass. We'll get a little bit closer in. So let's try that again. Okay, so the spatial query is not quite working. I think I queried too much information at one time, and so that didn't work out as I had planned. But let's see. The point really is that if you do a spatial query within a basin that has a certain amount of information, not too much, you can get at the acreage statistics within the viewer. Imperial Valley is probably a bad choice. It's quite a large basin with a lot of pasture in it. And so when you're going upwards 3,000, 4,000 polygons, the viewer can time out. All right, so we're moving on from the spatial filter. We'll just point out two other widgets that may be important for you. One is the add data. And so with the add data widget, we've provided some suggested layers that you can add in. Water districts. We also have DWR's detailed analysis units. And so you can add those into the map use those as your spatial reference. Or you can point to an ArcGIS server web service, some sample URLs. Essentially, you'll be finding any kind of publicly available web service, getting that REST endpoint and putting it in the viewer. That's for a slightly more advanced user. You can also reference a CSV file that's hosted with latitude and longitude. Or you can upload your own file with up to 1,000 features in it. So that's a shapefile, a CSV, or a GeoJSON. And so those can be added into the map and used as reference. The final thing is the print widget. And so if I turn the statewide crop mapping back on, I'll turn off the detailed analysis unit, maybe turn on the NAPE, come back to the print widget, and we see a window pop up that shows you the layout of the, essentially your window is what's going to be printed within this blue box. You can change that by sliding this in and out. You can set the DPI. It defaults to the copyright as the department, but you can put your own name there as the author of this map and change the title. You can also change the layout or the format, the output format. All right, so I think I was going to try the spatial query one more time, but I think it's best we actually address questions rather than playing with the application. And you can always send your questions in to me if something's not working right or if you didn't quite understand something with the demo.
Okay, thank you, Wyatt. So now we'll open up to questions. I'm going to show you how you can submit your questions or your comments. Just switch that. So again, if you want to submit your questions or comments, you can do so right here in the question box on your webinar control panel. And we have DWR staff standing by, Hong Lin and Lauren Hirsch, who will be queuing your questions and reading those aloud. So we'll just give a moment as we get questions and comments in, and we will move from there.
Okay, well, our first question is the data that's 96.6% accurate based on a combination of crops and acreage, or just only accuracy for irrigated acreage? Joel, I think that's you.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, for the question. Yeah, along with this and Wyatt's tool, it has a document section in it, and that has the final report of the mapping that was done by LandIQ, and in that it has a whole section on the summary report on accuracies and the accuracies of each individual crops and the overall accuracies from the statewide. I kept mentioning that the overall accuracies were 96.6% accurate. That's rolled up across all crops. Some crops were, like I mentioned, almonds were nearly 99% accurate, and then other crops may be in the lower 90s, but across the board is 96.6. That also includes, says in this question, or just accuracy for irrigated acreage. It is every individual crop and idle and fallow ground as well. And I just wanted to make one clarification. What Wyatt was showing you earlier in the web map in the Imperial Valley discussed a lot about pasture. That's the overarching classification, which does include alfalfa, which we know is the predominant crop in Imperial Valley.
We have a second question for you, Joel, so don't go away. For urban areas, do you delineate irrigated landscape areas? So
for this product, the answer is no. For other projects, the answer is yes. So we've done that in the past, but for this project, our scope of work was defined to just include the outer urban boundary of the urban area. So if there's a specific urban area that people want to dig in deeper with regards to the overall irrigated landscape areas, we've done that in the past in a variety of places.
Okay, thank you. Next, question asks, will historical county survey data, in other words, 1960s, ever be added to this tool? And let's see, Simon, can you help us out with that one?
Sure. At the moment, we are actually scanning some old historical data, and that data will not be added to the tool, but it's going to be added to the DWR Land Use website.
Okay, thank you. Next question is pasture as a land use referring only to irrigated pasture?
So we delineated anything that has a noticeable field boundary around it. And so it would include both irrigated and non-irrigated pasture, but that would have to show up as in an area perhaps in the state where it was green or during the peak season in 2014. This transitions over into areas that may be seasonal pasture in some of the higher elevations in the state. If it was an improved or managed system such that we could delineate a field, we delineated it. And so it was very comprehensive in grabbing, if you will, the bulk of anything that was improved in some way where we could put a polygon around it. And so there are absolutely pasture areas that may not be or may not have organized irrigation with them, but they are indeed there.
Thanks, Joel. Curtis, you're up next. What is the trajectory toward more frequent data updates? When will we get to insight on land use as it changes within a single year?
Okay, thank you. So the RFQ that we sent out was to actually do annual land use on a quarterly basis. So the contract and the abilities of Land IQ actually are to be able to do statewide land use on a quarterly basis. So really capturing that double cropping, triple cropping, where they do change their crops, you know, throughout the year, like Salinas and Imperial Valley and stuff like that. Frankly, the limiting factor right now is funding. So we were lucky enough to get granted, as I mentioned, the budget change proposal for $1 million a year for 4 years to kind of get this going. But in order to do quarterly land use on a statewide basis every year would require more than the funding that we have. So we would really love to partner with other agencies, if you're listening, to get additional funding, but it's much more than that. It really is going to take a partnership of different agencies that collect information and the local entities, counties, GSAs, water districts, all partnering together and working together to see what is effective for state agencies to collect and what is effective and efficient for others, locals, to collect, and really partner together and make this as accurate and as timely as possible.
Thanks, Curtis. The next several questions, I think, Wyatt, fall into your area. First is it possible to export the data set I have created by various clips and overlays? What will be the format of the data set? The data set will contain both the geographic and attribute data?
Yeah, so the answer to that question is yes. You can export various clips and overlays that are results of the spatial query tool. The format would be in a GeoJSON export format, and that's an open source JavaScript open source notation format that is specific for geographic features. It can, and that format, it's quite good for utilizing in many different GIS applications, but I caution you from using that export because it has been reprojected for the viewer, and then you're downloading it in that projection, and then you may, when you ingest that into another application, that application may reproject it again, and you're introducing inaccuracies into the data. And so I really emphasize that if you're going to do analysis with land use data, use the raw production data. Download the statewide data set or the data set that's been clipped to basin boundaries or the county. Don't use exports from the land use viewer as a result of spatial queries. That's really just a general provisional tool available to answer quick questions. The data set would contain the geographic and attribute data when you do that export. But again, it's provisional. The download option only lets you, okay.
Yep, okay, next question. Download option only lets 2014 land use data to be downloaded as shapefiles. How can I download earlier land use shapefiles such as 1996?
And so the way you would do that is turning on the county land use download and selecting any county. And first you'll see the county you selected with the number of surveys available. Go to the related table. You will see the 3 surveys available, of course, the most recent one being 2014, as well as 2002 DWR County Survey and 1995. And when you download that survey, you'll be receiving all the metadata associated with that survey.
Great. We have another question here. It asks, I heard you say the data was pre-clipped by various groupings, one being irrigated ag land within the Bulletin 118 boundary. I farm in Tulare County and want data to quantify the irrigated acreage outside if Bulletin 118 boundaries as this may have an impact to the water budget. How can I access the data of the irrigated acreage outside Bulletin 118?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first, there's 2 ways to do that. Either you can just get the statewide layer, and that will give you everything within and without that Bulletin 118 basin. Or let's turn on the basin boundaries here. And for example, let's say you wanted, you were in this basin right here in Tule, and you needed the land use outside of this area. Now notice, actually, that there is land use in the foothills here that you may want to capture. And so I really emphasize that even though you can download multiple pre-clipped basin land use from the remote sensing survey, it may make most sense to just go ahead and download the entire survey, and that way you can do subsequent GIS analysis and get everything according to your area of interest.
Would the export file have metadata so that I can know the projection?
Yes, so the, oh, I see. The export file from the spatial query, the GeoJSON will be, it won't tell you, it won't have metadata. So typically when you export geographic objects from a web application, you're going to get that in World Geographic System 1984, I believe. And so that's a projection that's optimized for web viewing. It won't show that in the data. So it's when you're exporting things from the spatial query tool, it's provisional. It's just to answer simple questions. But when you download the data using the download tool or selecting specific basin boundaries, you are getting the raw production data with full metadata available to you.
Great, thank you. Joel, this next one is for you. What do the fields or the polygons on the map represent? How are the boundaries determined? And are these polygons under a single ownership related to parcels? Or are the boundaries just roads around the fields?
So, very good question. And that, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's a couple things that make this information as accurate as it is. The boundaries around a field, don't confuse the word field with what, like, those of us who come from the agricultural industry determine a field. It is a field. It is a boundary that represents the irrigated portion of a field only. So the way I like to say it, you may have a APN boundary that's 40 acres, and you may have a farm shop in one corner of it that's 2 acres. The boundary that you will see in the mapping here is 38 acres. It does not represent any jurisdictional boundary or any legal boundary or anything like that, and it does not assign or have with it ownership. So these are strictly, you kind of have to think of this strictly as what's going on the surface of the ground. And so you can relate it to parcels by overlaying parcel boundaries on top of it and do some analyses that way. That's commonly asked. But right now, the data that you see here and can be downloaded are strictly land use data sets, and the boundaries are determined. It takes a lot of work to determine, and they are always constantly being updated so that we truly represent the true area, irrigated area of the field. Another way I like to put it is it's a homogeneous crop type or a homogeneous land use type within a boundary.
Okay, great. Another question for you, Joel. Is it possible to identify irrigated grassed areas with no trees that are publicly owned medians?
I'm assuming this, when it talks about medians, I'm assuming an urban area. And the answer to that is yes. It's a different type of analysis, different than what we've done for DWR. You know, the urban areas that we provided for DWR were kind of we're kind of filling in the puzzle, basically, and those are puzzle pieces that we could delineate out and provide as well with the other agricultural and managed wetland areas. But yes, the answer to that question is yes, we can delineate out grassed areas that are medians and other vegetated areas within urban areas, just a different type of analysis.
Great, thank you. Is there a plan to classify dairy and feedlot properties?
You know, we received this, we just gave this presentation 2 days ago at the plenary session for the 2018 water plan, and this question came up. It's a good question. I don't know if there's a plan to do that, but the effort to do that would not be too difficult because there is publicly available information regarding dairies, and then also the crops around those dairies many times are forage crops of which the dairies use. And so through a little bit of an analysis, you can determine where those dairies are and feedlot properties. And I think Wyatt also showed a couple days ago an additional publicly available layer that has those feedlots or dairy areas already delineated. So it's in there in that tool. Wyatt may show it to you when Simon's asking a question here, or answering a question.
Okay. Well, we have next question for Simon. Any plans in the future to incorporate this land use data into actual crop consumptive use data?
Yes. What we're going to do is we have actual consumptive use and then estimated consumptive use. Right now, we're going to incorporate that into a consumptive use model as part of the parameters of the model. But we're also working with NASA to have a model that uses remote sensing that we can use this data as an input also to that model to get actual conservative water use, and that's going to be in the future. But right now, we can actually use that to estimate using a conservative water use model computer that we're going to use it. But it's not actual, but it is estimated conservative water use.
Okay, thank you. Joel, back to you. Prisons appear to not be classified as urban or anything. Can they be added into this class?
They can be. I find nowadays there is plentiful publicly available data, spatial data, such like dairies, and I'm assuming that there's probably a prison data out there somewhere that can be added into the class. It is not, as the question asks, currently in the classification. It may be grouped because if a prison is in an urban area, such as maybe Folsom Prison, it would be included within that urban boundary. If it's the need to delineate that out, that could be done in a variety of ways.
Okay, great. The land use mapping is based on what spatial resolution? Joel, do you want to take that?
Sure. And why you want to add? Okay, I'll take care. So the spatial resolution, again, we delineate fields down to about 2 acres, so that's the polygon size. The spatial resolution of those field boundaries is within 2 or 3 meters, if I'm not mistaken, on the delineations of those boundaries as to where that irrigated portion of that field begins or ends. And so that is the resolution, if you will, of the boundary itself.
Great, thanks. And here's another one for you. So is the boundary just a break in an otherwise continuously vegetated area? It could be a road, could be a drain, could be a line of trees separating 2 vineyards. What are some examples of boundaries?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So again, the boundary encompasses a homogeneous crop type or a homogeneous land use. And if there is what we'll call a farm road in between 2 blocks of land, so there's a large area of, I don't know, almonds, and they want to access farm road in between, and it's an 80-acre block, but they wanted an access farm road, a dirt road that is there, greater than, I believe it's 12 feet, 10 to 12 feet. We delineate that road out. So it is not an irrigated area, so it's not included in the area of the irrigated portion of that field. It could also be a line of trees, such as a windbreak, I suppose. And we're very, very careful with those boundaries because we fully recognize that really drives not only a very accurate assessment of the irrigated area, but it also drives our accuracies.
Right.
And other examples of boundaries, as I mentioned, can be farm shops, roads, canals, anything kind of greater than that 8 to 10 foot distance.
Great, thank you. I think we have come to the end of our questions now.
Yeah, this is Stephen again. Thank you, Lauren and Hong, for administering the questions, and thank you to the team for those answers. And thank you all for those great questions. So if we didn't get to your question or you have future questions on any of these topics you heard today, please feel free to reach out to the following individuals on this slide related to the topic of your question for future information. And so with that, I'd like to wrap up this webinar and first thank all of you for attending today, the great questions, and also thank you to CCP, Stephanie Horry, for being the facilitator today and helping set up this webinar, and to our whole land use team and those that haven't presented today but are back at our headquarters offices or region offices. Thank you to all of those that have helped get this data set out and publicly available. So with that, we'll be signing off, and stay tuned for additional future SGMA sessions or tech talks in the future. Thank you.